We are going to get started. So thank you to everybody that's joining us. My name is Dolly Singh. I'm going to be hosting us today. Welcome to Sanity's Sanity series. Our goal is to give you guys real talk from brilliant women. Our guests today are really remarkable women. Marsha Ivins, who's a renowned NASA astronaut, and Dr. Linda Polfus, who's an adjunct professor at USC and also a PhD in Genetic Epidemiology. Our format today is going to be pretty simple. We're going to do a few icebreakers, which will be a group discussion. Then I'm going to do a one-on-one Q&A with each of the ladies. Then we're going to come back for a little bit more meaningful, meaty topics on group discussion. Then we've got a few questions that we grabbed from the audience in advance. Then we'll fire those at you ladies, and then that should be the end of our hour. Sound good to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's do icebreakers first. So I'll tell you guys a story. So I first sent some icebreaker questions, and Marsha was like, these are not going to make it. These are not good enough. And I said, okay, you're right. Good call out. So then I went back to the drawing board, and I tried to come up with some that were truly worthy of this panel and these remarkable women. So first off, let's start with a softball, and then we'll get a little bit spicier. So I'd love to hear from each of you guys what your morning routine is. So Linda, maybe you start this one, and then Marsha, I'm going to come to you.
Sure. So first I grabbed my phone and I looked at my LinkedIn feed to see what colleagues are posting about COVID developments. And then I get up, I make coffee with my stovetop mocha and go for a walk outside to start my day. I live in Los Feliz, kind of by Griffith Park. Although the park is closed right now, we can still walk around the neighborhood with a mask. So, and then I start my day by working remotely and logging in.
Well, it's good to know that I'm not the only one that picks up their phone first thing in the morning and starts scouring for usually what is not good news. Marsha, what about you?
Kind of similar. I get up in the morning whenever the sun gets up. I check the news to make sure nothing's changed. I do an exercise class, usually a streaming one, and then I walk for about an hour. And then I come back and get on with whatever the day has in store.
Okay, I love that. I'm probably similar. I check the news, which is a bad habit. I told my kids that at this point, you know, it's like every bad reality TV show and movie that's ever been made, like, has come to life, right? So I feel like if I got up one day and the news story was that there are going to be dinosaurs running down the street this morning, I would probably not even bat an eyelash at this point, right? Okay, awesome. Let's do the next one. So what I'd like to know is from each of you, and Marsha, I'll have you kick this one off, is what do you think is the greatest scientific mystery right now? What's the thing that we don't know that you wish we could find out?
I think that it's, are we alone in the universe?
Okay.
Because really, I mean, you know, if you've ever been in a place where the sky is very dark and you see all of the stars, that's kind of what you see from space when there is no light pollution, and you think, how can it be possible that we are it? And we don't know. So I think that's what it is.
And what's your perspective on that? What do you think?
I think, how could we possibly be it in billions of galaxies that each have billions of stars that, you know, have all the planets around them? How could we possibly be it? So I'm hoping, you know, if you look at where we live in the Milky Way galaxy, we're sort of out in the burbs. And so maybe we just haven't seen anybody in the hood yet.
Okay. There's like a paradox, right? It's a scientific principle of some sort, which in theory, there's so much space out there that it's impossible that we should be by ourselves. But then also, why has nobody found us, and why have we not found any of them, right?
Well, but the other part of that paradox is that civilizations develop to the point where they self-destruct.
Well, that's
so they never get to where they are true star-faring kind of civilizations.
Wow, that gave me goosebumps, but not in a good way. Let's hope that we are the exception to the rule. All right, Linda, what about you? What do you think is the greatest scientific mystery?
I mean, it kind of piggybacks on Marsha's point. I kind of wonder, like, the origins of life, like what happened before the Big Bang? How did the first eukaryotic cells, come to be? And then you think about eukaryotic cells and that they were RNA, basically with a lipid bilayer, self-replicating, kind of like a virus. So I was watching this Morgan Freeman documentary. It was kind of on in the background, and it was kind of cataloging all the different types of religious beliefs and kind of connecting both the universe and life, with God, or looking at every belief on the spectrum. So, I mean, that's kind of one of the questions that I don't know if we'll actually be able to answer unless we do have contact with, life outside of our own.
Okay, I love that. So mine is, this is silly in comparison to the sophisticated answers that you guys gave. But so I know that space-time is expanding, but then what is it expanding into? Because if that's space-time, then what is it expanding into? So I don't understand that, and I doubt that I ever will. So, so let's move on actually to our Q&A. So I'm going to jump to Miss Marsha. I'm going to start off with you. So I want to hear the story of how you became an astronaut and what was the greatest challenge in achieving that life goal.
I am a child of the 50s and the 60s, and so when I was a kid, there were no astronauts. When I was 10 years old, in 1961, so do the math, we sent our first American into space, Alan Shepard, and I was captivated by that and decided that that's what I wanted to do, somehow work in the space program. The biggest challenge at the time is that astronauts were all men, and they were all military test pilots. And at 10 years old, I figured they'll get over that by the time I'm old enough to fly. And I didn't really think much more of it. However, I couldn't be a guy, and I couldn't be a military pilot at the time, but I could be an engineer, and that's what they were, was engineers. So I went off to school to be an engineer. And then I started applying to NASA. Actually got selected as an engineer in 1974 and went to work for the space program in Houston. And 10 years later, and 3 applications later, into the astronaut office, I was selected.
And you make it sound so easy, like it was something that anybody could do.
I mean, that's the sort of Reader's Digest.
I love this about astronauts. They make it sound like, it's just the thing that you do. I get up, I have my coffee, and then I accidentally get selected for the astronaut corps.
Oh, it wasn't accidental. I mean, I was rejected.
So talk to me about the level of fortitude it took for you to achieve that, especially in a time and age when astronauts were mostly men. And actually, Linda, I'm going to ask both of us to go off camera just to improve the camera quality for Marsha. And so I'll still be here with you, Marsha. I'm just you'll see my photo instead of my face for a bit.
Okay, well, that's kind of frightening. But, all right. I decided it was something that I wanted to do. And if I couldn't be selected as an astronaut, I was working for NASA. And that was actually the goal. I thought astronaut would be the epitome of that job. And after I was rejected the second time, I was actually offered a separate job flying with NASA and got selected the third time. I would have tried a fourth time and a fifth time if that's what it required.
And what do you think was like the most difficult part of that, other than having to reapply and having to be committed? But what was either academically, physically, what do you think was the greatest challenge that you had to overcome in achieving that?
Well, I was fortunate, which I have no idea why, but probably 40% of the people that apply are rejected for medical reasons and things that you are perfectly healthy living with, but the NASA criteria rejects you for that. So I did not get rejected for a medical reason. original selection criteria was that everybody needed to be a PhD, and I'm not a PhD. I'm not a master's. I have an undergraduate degree. And the year I was selected, they had changed that selection criteria to a graduate degree or 10 years of work experience in a related field. And I had been working now at NASA for 10 years. So I was lucky, and I will never say anything other than I was in the right place at the right time, and I got lucky.
I'm pretty sure that's probably not the case, but I'm going to let you slide on that one. So here's one of our topics, and one of the things that I personally have been figuring out how to self-manage is like managing my own fear and not letting it be paralyzing, frankly, right? So strapping yourself to a rocket is essentially, in my mind, akin to putting yourself on a 10-story bomb and being like, light her up. So not very different from that. So it must take a tremendous amount of just the ability to manage fear to be able to do that, because I feel like as humans, our natural instinct is to survive, right? So doing things that are literally death defying take a very special type of person. So how can we learn from however you did that so we can be better at managing fear?
Well, I don't know how to answer that, because it wasn't a fear sitting on, a bomb. And one would say that I'm sort of missing a part of my brain in order to say that. But I like to fly. I was not a risk taker as a child. I don't actually like roller coasters. I'm actually afraid to be underwater with scuba gear. So I have my own fears. But sitting on the rocket was not one of them. The biggest fear sitting on the rocket and going to space was that I would screw up somehow. I mean, they used to say that was the astronaut's prayer. Please don't let me screw this up. And that actually was the biggest fear. And to overcome that, you just have to rely on your training and the team that you're working with, and hope that you do it right, even if things go wrong.
And then how do you feel like going to space impacted you, right? I've been very lucky in my career that working at SpaceX gave me the opportunity to get to know a few people that have had, the opportunity to go to space, right? And they do seem, remarkably, like in some profound way, it impacts them and it changes their perspective. And most of them say they wish people could experience that. So we can't all experience it, just not yet. So how can we vicariously live through your experience? Help us understand what it was like and how it changes your perspective here on Earth.
I get asked that question quite often, and here's my answer. I'm not sure that going to space actually changed my perspective, but here's what did change the perspective. Having gone to space gave me the opportunity to go tell the story of going to space all over the world. That was part of our job as astronauts, was to do that kind of public speaking. And so I told my story, which was not my story. It was the story of what we did as the American Space Program, to students literally all over the world, with translators, and pick a place. And what I learned is that no matter where I went, people laughed at the same things, they oohed and awed at the same things, they asked the same questions. So the lesson there was that people are the same all over the world. And that, to me, was a very powerful lesson, particularly for Americans that don't usually travel. We don't get out of our own borders, so we don't sort of cross-pollinate with other cultures. But to understand that, I think that's the thing that changed me the most about going to space.
Well, if there's one thing I would hope that this current crisis is teaching us all, is that we are all the same, frankly, So, talk to me a little bit about how you've handled the last 2 months. Do you feel like your training prepared you in some way? Do you feel like you are like better off for having been through those experiences? And if you do, what can we learn? And if you don't, like, are we all in the same boat of like uncertainty and some level of like, you have to accept that we can't control everything right now?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question. I retired from NASA 10 years ago, and this is my normal life. I mean, this is sort of the way I live all the time. I do a little bit of work, but I don't have a full-time job. I don't have a really active social life. I'm pretty dull, in all things considered. And, I laughed at people because this is welcome to my world. I mean, this is kind of the way I live all the time.
Okay, so would you call yourself an introvert then?
Yeah.
Okay. That's part of my theory is I think this is especially painful for the extroverts. And it has, like, some introverts have found out that they're less introverted than they thought they were, because now that the opportunity to interact so much with people is different, they do miss that. And then there's some people that are totally fine with it. And so I admire that. And I'm going to try to channel my inner introvert.
Well, I've actually been more social in the past 2 months than I have in a long time. I mean, as I'm walking, everybody's out walking now. Everybody says hello. Everybody's really friendly. People are nice in the store. People are kind and they're calm and and everybody checks in. Friends I haven't talked to in a long time are phoning and FaceTiming and things like that. So I've been very social actually in the past 2 months.
I would agree with that. I think there are definitely some silver linings to be pointed out, and we'll do that a little bit in our discussion topic. So let me give you my last question for you right now. So I think leadership is always super critical, and in times of crisis, more critical than ever. I personally have not been super impressed with leadership at a federal level. That's my personal opinion. I have been more happy with, at least here in California, we've at least tried to be a little bit more proactive. But I think we've seen a variety of leadership styles, and you probably have been exposed to a lot of great lessons in leadership. So what would good leadership look like to you in this situation?
I think good leadership looks the same no matter what your situation is. And just because your name is at the top of the org chart, that does not automatically make you a leader. I have a composer friend that I was listening to an interview he did once, and somebody said to him, how do you compose and conduct an orchestra that has 110 pieces in it if you don't play all of the instruments? And his answer was, I don't have to play all of the instruments. I have to understand the sound they make, their capability, and then I have to blend them, integrate them together in order to create the piece of music and get the sound that I want. And I think a good leader, regardless of whether you're leading 5 people or you're leading a country or you're leading a company or an organization, has to be able to understand the people that are working in that company, their strengths and their weaknesses, the thing that you want to achieve in that company, whether it's a product or education or run a country, whatever it is, and then integrate that and use your tools and your resources to the best advantage to get the job done. And I think you need to respect the people that are working in the company. I think you need to respect the environment that the company is in so that you understand what the risks are. And when you can balance all of that with respect and with trust, I think then you're a good leader.
Who's the best leader you've ever worked with in your career?
His name is Mike Griffin, and he was the NASA administrator quite a few years ago.
I've heard a lot of good things about Mr. Griffin, so good to hear that. Okay, awesome. So, Marsha, I'm going to have you switch your camera off for a bit. Miss Linda, if you'll switch yours on. There she is. Fabulous. Okay, amazing. So that was awesome. And so I'm super excited now to jump into your questions, Miss Linda. So tell us about how and why you became a genetic epidemiologist. And maybe you want to actually tell everybody what a genetic epidemiologist is.
Okay. So epidemiology is the study of disease in population. We use a lot of statistics and logic and tracking and organization to understand the prevalence, the distribution of disease, genetics. Now everyone is very familiar using different companies, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, to map their genetics. So certain genetic variants confer risk to various diseases, and I kind of track that risk. I've primarily been working recently in common complex disease like COPD, cancers, and heart disease. So back to the question of how I became one. Yes, so I completed my undergraduate in biology, and I was looking, for a job, and I ended up working at the Portland VA in this emerging infectious disease network. And it was a network funded by the CDC, where infectious disease doctor would query all of the doctors across the nation to figure out if there had been any infectious diseases of an infectious etiology that had that didn't really fit other common or previously diagnosed disorders, and then also to figure out drug resistance. So since then, I decided to pursue statistics and epidemiology at Tulane, and then also lived in Houston. Marsha lived in Houston. So spent quite a bit of time in Houston doing both my PhD and postdoc in the lab, and then also doing statistical work. And then now work as an assistant professor in clinical preventive medicine at University of Southern California.
Okay, amazing. Similar to a question I had for Marsha, where does your training and your experience make you feel more prepared? Does it feel like a blessing or a curse? So, like, does knowing more about disease make you more freaked out, or do you feel like you have some sense of control via your knowledge and expertise?
I would say I feel somewhat empowered because even if it's not my particular topic area, I can read the literature and know the basic principles to kind of ascertain if that study is adhering to those principles. And then, I guess different sources I'm looking at right now there are some like fast-tracked New England Journal of Medicine articles that are probably too small to make any definitive conclusions, but still that's the beginning of the research. It's a little bit frustrating when you think about the timeline of science. It takes a while to get to the answers, and that's just the reality. But I think like this epidemiologic framework provides like the scientific evidence to drive policy and improve human health and save lives. So being organized and having the public health infrastructure in place and not like cutting all the funding for infectious disease and then saying, whoops, now we have a pandemic. Mm-hmm. We need to be prepared.
Yes, I'll second that. Firing your entire infectious disease department is generally a bad idea, at least so we have come to find out. But so I'd like to know a little bit about some of the data sources that you're using. You're an expert in stats and modeling. I shared with you an article this morning where in LA they did more of a random test for the antibodies. There was also a study out of Stanford that did a similar test where it looks like the rate of exposure is an order of magnitude, if not more, higher than current like known caseload. So if that's the case, is that good news or bad news? Because on one hand, that means the mortality rate is lower and probably more in line with something that looks like a flu, or is it still not good news? And I'd also like for you to help us understand a little bit about like, why is this so different from the flu, which kills, 30, 40,000 Americans a year, or different from other causes of death like obesity or car accidents? Because I've heard what I think is a very false analogy made. And so I'd like your perspective on that. So I know that was a lot of questions in one.
Maybe I'll start with the last question.
Yeah, let's start with that one and work backward.
Yes. Okay, so I guess briefly the difference between the flu and COVID-19 is that we have not built immunity to COVID-19, and we have for the flu. Another major difference is we don't know exactly how to treat the symptoms. So for the flu, we have some drugs in mind. For COVID-19, we're still repurposing drugs used for other disorders and applying them to COVID-19, hopefully in large clinical trials to see if those will work. So I guess in terms of the analogy with a car accident, well, I would say in a car accident, the death rate cannot move up exponentially, as in the context of a virus. You can't infect other people with a car accident. I mean, you can hit another car, but it's not like you're going to go to the doctor and infect the hospital staff. Mm-hmm. So that's an important, it is, we can't take measures to prevent it. So we want to keep those in check. Can you remind me of the earlier questions, please?
So it seems like a lot of it is based on the unpredictability and the unknown. So what are some of the data sources that you have found credible or that you're relying on when you're thinking about your day-to-day decisions?
So I think a good place to start is your state Department of Health website, because that will kind of drill down by county level. But then also just looking, there's, I think, a good Johns Hopkins COVID-19 counting website that I look, across the world. I check that. Other sources I look at are medRxiv, but those are articles that have not been peer reviewed yet, but they are kind of the latest science and give kind of a direction things are going. And then another place I look is New England Journal of Medicine, because I think a lot of those articles are getting fast-tracked, or I think Nature and Cell have some as well in terms of the pathophysiology of what we're trying to understand so far.
And what was your perspective on the data that came out of LA and Santa Clara County, where they're doing this randomized antibody testing that shows exposure levels might be significantly higher than what we currently might think? Is that good or is that bad?
So let me backtrack a little. I think there are two parts to that. One where it was a random design done. I think they were attempting, it was done by Dr. Sood from USC, and they were attempting to recruit 1,000 people that were randomly selected. And regardless, so you didn't know, they could have had no symptoms and had COVID antibody. They could have no symptom, no positive result at all. So I think that is good in terms of putting that type of information in the state health department models, because it gives you more of an idea of the transmission rate, and then if we're going to use some kind of tracing, contact tracing mechanism, how strong of a need is there? Because these asymptomatic people could be infecting others and not even realize it. And then I think the other part from Santa Clara, that was a second study, they actually recruited people from Facebook. Mm-hmm. And that was people who were, may have had some symptoms. There may have been some bias. So, it's also good to gather as much information as possible, even if it's convenient sampling. But this type, of study isn't isn't the gold standard that we like to see in general in terms of calculating these percentages.
Okay, awesome. I'd love to know a little bit from you on what the vaccine development process looks like. I know that they're using some experimental treatments where they're treating patients with blood plasma from patients who have already processed the virus. So that sounds to me similar to like the methodology of a flu vaccine, where you use some small amount of the virus to inoculate people. So are there like proven methodologies that will hopefully allow us to, that for other coronaviruses like the flu, that will allow us to expedite and potentially actually have a vaccine in this 18-month time frame? Or do we think that that's really probably too aggressive of a timeline? Because I think the part that you can't shortcut, even if you shortcut all the regulations, is the testing, right? You need to give it to people and make sure that over the next year that they're okay and they don't develop any adverse reactions, right? So I think there's no way to shortcut the safety testing process in the vaccine development process. Is that correct? And kind of give me like a roadmap of what that looks like.
Sure. So I guess they did the genetic sequencing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that was released in January, and that has really set people up to start investigating as many vaccines, targets as possible. There's a good article that was published in Nature Reviews on April 9th. It's called The COVID-19 Vaccine Development Landscape. And right now, what was reported in that article is that there's over 100 vaccine candidates, and 78 of those are confirmed in preclinical testing. And these are on about 10 different technology platforms. So you're absolutely right. There's, a very long, or not very long, but there's a process to vaccine development. And I'll just briefly kind of go over those. So the first phase is kind of the exploratory phase. It's where they use either natural or synthetic antigens that might help prevent or treat. And then the antigens might include weakened strains of the COVID-19 virus. And then there's the preclinical stage where they start testing some of their targets in tissue culture or cell culture systems, and also in animal models to see if it will actually produce immunity. And then the next part is, once you think you have a good target and some evidence that it's produced immunity, the investigator would go to the FDA and submit a proposal and put in an application for an investigational new drug. Then it goes through 3 phases. The first phase is usually done in humans, or it's done in humans, and it's in less than 100 people. And it's to track, is it safe, and does it provoke an immune response? Then phase 2 includes well over hundreds of people, and it also documents the safety and immunization schedule and the dose size, like how much you want to deliver and how often. And then phase 3 is the largest of the studies, and it's in tens of thousands of people, and you test participants to look for side effects that you may not have seen in those smaller phases of studies. And then they have a regulatory review and approval, and they submit that application to the FDA. They have to manufacture it in mass quantities and be able to distribute that. So I think I've heard one report from, I think it was Johnson & Johnson, that used artificial intelligence or previous research on a target that they thought would be a good home run. So they already started mass producing it. They'll have to do all the other testing as well, but if it proves to be successful, they'll have it ready. So, I mean, that's kind of, a pro and con of how much do you want to spend in a maybe.
It's like buying the Super Bowl hats for both teams, and one of the teams is going to get to use them and one isn't, right? No, so, right. I mean, but do you think it is a given that a vaccine will be developed? Because I almost feel like that is a very, it's a optimistic assumption on our part, right? Like, not every code can be cracked, right? So is there a statistical likelihood in your mind of whether or not this is a code that can be cracked based on whatever data you've seen?
I would say, based on what I'm seeing in the literature, that this will be cracked based on the previous knowledge they have from the SARS kind of trials. So yeah. They already have some information about the inducing neutralizing antibodies in the viral spike protein. So they know the structure of the virus based on SARS, and then they know that it enters the cell by connecting through this angiotensin converting enzyme, or the ACE2 receptor. And so they're trying to block, that kind of communication. So it won't be able to reproduce inside the cell. That's just one of the approaches. Like I said, there's over 100 vaccine candidates. So they're all some of them are using different approaches. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it would be highly unlikely that we will not have a vaccine. And, I hear the reports are 18 months, but with everyone working on it night and day, part of me wonders if it won't be faster.
Okay, well, that made me feel a lot better. Thank you, Linda. That was great. It was like opposite goosebumps from when Marsha was like, well, except that all species tend to self-destruct before they get to the opportunity. So hopefully we'll be the exception. But let me, Marsha, have you pop back in so you can turn your camera back on. Linda, keep yours on. I'm going to leave mine off just so it'll improve the video quality for both of you ladies. And then we can jump into our group discussion topics. Marsha, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Oh, there you are. Okay, great. She's back. Okay, amazing. So the first topic we touched on a little bit, and I definitely want to get both of you guys' input. It's about what I think are related concepts, right? Isolation and fear. So the isolation is a new experience for most of us. I feel like it's like collectively the entire world has been put on house arrest. So one of the next people I want to talk to is like somebody that studies like the mind of people that have to be incarcerated or have to be in any sort of isolated circumstance, because it's like, what's happening in my brain? I'm curious about. But so give me your perspective on, I get that you're an introvert, and so this doesn't feel that scary for you. But what are some of the things that you learned in extreme isolation, like being in outer space, like being in a tiny, tiny tin can being launched into space? So talk to me about what those extreme cases of isolation did to potentially prepare you so well, given that you're just taking this all in stride. And then Linda, I'd love to come to you right after and get your perspective on the same thing. So Marsha, I'll have you kick off.
Well, first of all, what we did on the shuttle was not extreme isolation. If we had a crew of 5, 6, or 7 in the volume the size of a small bus, yes, with a door locked from the outside, and that's not isolation.
That's like the opposite.
Living on top of people for 2 weeks. There in the space shuttle, there was almost no place you could go where you couldn't see or hear, occasionally smell another person. So that is not isolation.
Well, what about, so we had one of the audience questions, and I'm just going to jump to this briefly, with what about people that are isolated or like with somebody who they don't like, somebody who may not be an ideal partner? What's your perspective on managing through isolation with people that you may not necessarily want to be in close quarters with for extended periods of time?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Contrary to popular belief, space shuttle crews, space station crews, are not psychologically matched. So quite often you fly with people that are not your best friends, and you are stuck with seeing the best and the worst of them up close and personal for that duration of time. What you learn is that, when you put us in a space shuttle or in a space station, the most important thing is trust, because you are in a hazardous environment, and my life depends on yours, and your life depends on me. So you have to trust that person. What you learn is respect. Privacy, which is the hardest thing to get, is something you give somebody. It's not something you create with walls and borders and things around you. It's the respect of affording somebody the privacy of not being up in their space when they're trying to do something that doesn't involve you. And so I think in this situation where people are under house arrest in a lot of cases, you need to be respectful of other people's privacy or desire for privacy and let them have their space, even if it means being in another room or not chiming into their conversation, whatever it is that they need. You have to do that. And that's not something we come by naturally, sadly. It's something you have to willingly school yourself to do. And I think that's probably what you learn in our kind of isolated environment.
Okay, that was very insightful. Linda, what about you?
Okay, which part?
So how are you managing through isolation and fear? Let's talk about that specifically.
Oh, yeah, I guess like I'll definitely feel some sense of isolation, but usually it passes pretty quickly. I just try to remember that everyone is going through the same exact experience. And then I try to also reach out to friends and family, either through Zoom or talking on the phone. I think Marsha's exactly right about going on walks and people being even more friendly because they're a little cooped up as well. It's like places I used to work out are now doing online streaming of their workout videos. So you see at least some familiar faces from the public, from these other outside places you used to go. Yeah, I guess also it's like I spend probably a lot of time writing. So that's something you do alone. You're not constantly talking to someone. So I'm somewhat used to it as well.
Well, and it sounds like some of the strategies I think we're using are pretty common, right? Like one of the things that I've done is I've worked pretty hard to like build a routine, and like I have the little checkpoints in my day that I look forward to. I do a walk, like late morning, and then I do a walk early evening, and then like in the morning I'm looking forward to my coffee, then I'm looking forward to my walk, then I'm looking forward to this, I play volleyball with my daughter. So I have tried to build a micro routine, right? And try to use that as like a like sanity coping mechanism. But it sounds like, exercise clearly, right, is something that we can all do and is activating our minds and our brains in some meaningful way and giving us something positive neurochemically. Trying to eat right. I've certainly been, more mindful of that. I've also been eating my fair share of chocolate cake, but hey, no judgment here on this call. Okay, awesome. So let's jump to our second topic. What do we think? I actually have been super irritated when I keep hearing this, like, when do we go back to normal? Because I literally think like normal is gone. That universe, like we somehow, crossed a threshold and there's no way to go backward. And there are parts of it, frankly, that I don't think we should go back to, right? So there are some silver linings that have come out of this. So what do you guys think, the new normal should look like? What is something that we are desperate to have back and we do want to bring back? And what's something that we maybe shouldn't bring back so quickly? Linda, I'll have you kick this one off, and then Marsha, I'm going to come to you.
Well, I think people definitely want to go to the beach and hiking trails. That's something, I've been missing. I live right next to Griffith Park, so it would be nice to have those reopen. That's going to require people wearing masks and social distancing, and maybe even counting the number of people that are on the trails at a time until we have the treatment and vaccines in place. I think probably the repeated testing for antibodies, not just once, but repeatedly, will become necessary.
And the challenge for that, though, Linda, one of the things I read, the bottleneck is that the reacting agents used to do this antibody testing, that there's a bottleneck on that supply, right? So this is a totally separate question, but how scalable is our testing capacity and why are we so far behind?
I mean, that's a good question. I think they're trying to map that out through the roadmap to recovery and roll out 20 million tests. But I mean, there's the progression of the disease where, you're not even showing antibodies. And then it's like, we don't know the immunity, like once you have been exposed to COVID, what's your immunity afterward? We are still trying to track, those kinds of rates. So it's in progress.
Okay. All right. So Marsha, now to you. Now I know that your life hasn't changed a ton, so this will impact your answer clearly, but you've at least seen the outside world shift a bit. So what do you think is something that you'll be happy to see return to quote unquote normal? And what's something that you think should become part of the new normal?
Well, the whole idea of a new normal, I think, is a matter of perspective. If you think about it, life is a chronology of new normals. From the time you are young to when you mature and go older, get older, you go to school, you have a family. They're all new normals. Our ability to accept the new normal in our life is a skill set we already have. And this is, normally those things don't change as a result of the environment around you, unless you have an earthquake or a fire or a flood. But then that's fairly local. In this case, the environment around us has changed globally. But the ability to deal with that you have inherent in yourself is the same as it is in the rest of your life as you get on with things. So, you'll find out you roll with it. If you have to wear a mask, all right, you find a mask that you can wear that isn't industrial looking, and, mask design will flourish somewhere along the line. I think people will feel safer when they can actually find hand sanitizer and wipes in stores again.
Yeah.
And people will find a new way to do the things that they like to do. It's just another normal.
That was great perspective, actually. I never thought about that way. So that really, was like a breath of fresh air. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask each of you guys, and Linda, I'll come back to you. What are three, and we kind of covered this a little bit when we talked about our routine and some of the things that we're doing to stay sane, but what are three pieces of advice that you have for everybody that's watching, either on how to stay healthy or how to stay like mentally sane, or things that you think we practically should be doing to keep society safe? So three takeaways that you want the audience to remember.
Okay. Well, I would say if you can, eat your fruits and vegetables and as healthy as possible, because we're spending a lot of time streaming online movies. and then just, this isn't going to last forever. Keeping that in mind. And then just to be kind to everyone around you as much as possible, because everyone is encountering a lot of different circumstances, economic circumstances as a result of this pandemic. Those would be mine. That's
great. I love that. So eat healthy, like channel our inner Buddhist, which is all things are temporary, and be kind. I think that those are awesome. Marsha, what about you?
Well, I would go with the be kind thing. I mean, people are being, lovely at the moment, at least around my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
The increase in communication with friends and family, that's kind of nice. People are reaching out that didn't reach out before, maybe because they're bored, and keep that up. I mean, how lovely is that to talk to people, to see people, that you haven't seen, even if you're not there in person.
Mm-hmm.
And, I guess be respectful of people. Not everybody is doing well in this pandemic. I mean, and I think we need to acknowledge that and help where we can and be respectful in all respects of that, because not everybody is good.
Absolutely. I agree with 100%, right? I think I try to, even in the moments where I feel like this sense of affect setting in, like trying to lead with gratitude that I have a roof over my head, that my kids have food in their belly. So duly noted and absolutely agreed. So I'm going to jump to the audience Q&A questions. Marsha, I'm going to throw the first one at you. I thought this was a great question that somebody had asked specifically of you, which is, do you ever lack willpower? And what do you do in those moments?
Well, if you put chocolate in front of me, I absolutely have no willpower. So, to assume that I, have ironclad willpower is ridiculous. Astronauts are just like everybody else. We have our weaknesses and we have our vices like chocolate. So, that's mine.
Okay, but so what do you do? So even if you're just like us humans, how do you resist the chocolate cake when you need to?
Oh, well, when I need to, I was going to say, what makes you think I do resist it? I have a little less than I really want.
Okay, moderation.
In moderation, yeah. You school yourself to say, okay, this is going to hurt, or this is going to be bad. And I can have more of it tomorrow.
Okay, I love it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about focusing on the things you can control. And, the amount of chocolate cake you eat is one thing you can control.
Well, I think there's a saying, right? All things in moderation, including moderation. That's like my favorite. Okay, Linda, next one is to you. One that's particularly of interest to me as a person of color. There seems to be some troubling racial disparities as we're seeing this COVID-19 data. Give me your perspective on that.
So one of the studies I work on is called the multi-ethnic cohort, and it looks at 5 different ethnic groups in Los Angeles and Hawaii. So it's very important. We have seen that COVID-19 affects those with comorbidities, and there are certain ethnic groups that have higher risk of comorbidities that could make their virus more severe. So, how much of it is proximity in housing or going to the supermarket or family life, these kind of socio factors, or how much of it is genetics, the underlying genetics that is from, the comorbid conditions themselves. Mm-hmm. I think it's important just to have understand these differences so we can target certain subgroups and say, look, you need to be a little more careful. You need to wear your face mask even more, or, so they're aware, and we can, so those disparities will at some point attenuate.
I mean, I think there's absolutely got to be like confounding variables, but you do see that even in other things like regular labor and delivery, you see disparate rates of like unideal outcomes for women of color. Like you tend to have more labor complications. So I think there are like deeper issues that we don't have time to talk about today. And probably too early to tell, especially on this, because we don't know enough about this. But it's certainly one of the things that I hope those in charge and our leaders are looking out for. I know that here in Los Angeles and also in New Jersey, between Governor Cuomo and at least here locally in LA, Mayor Garcetti, they have been trying to really speak specifically to those communities, make sure that they know that that you need to be extra vigilant. So I am glad to see some of that. All right, Marsha, last question for you, and then Linda, one more for you, and then we're going to do our sign off. So how do you stay fit and motivated to work out in a small space? And then very specifically, what happens when you sweat in space? Because I know that water droplets turn into little circles and like float around. So is there like random sweat circulating in the ISS until the vacuum system takes it out?
So there is exercise equipment that we had in the shuttle and that we have on the International Space Station that allows you to do both aerobic and resistive kind of exercise. And just as a little biological data point there, in the early days of space flying, people were coming back and losing up to 17% of their bone mass as a result of being without gravity for extended periods of time. With this exercise protocol now, there is really almost no measurable bone loss. And so the guys on the space station exercise 2 hours every day. Mm. And when you do exercise, you do sweat. And normally when we sweat, the beads of sweat come out, but gravity is sliding them down your face and sliding them down your body, and you shake it off. But there's nothing without gravity that causes sweat balls to slide. So they just bead up on you. So what you'll find is somebody will, shake their head and fling sweat balls out into the atmosphere. And And on my shuttle flights, I used to sit there and just sort of whack people with towels in order to keep the sweat balls from getting in my face. And the other thing you can do is you can take an air hose basically and focus it on you, and then it'll evaporate them. But just like any other kind of sweat, you use a towel, it soaks it up.
I'm going to have all kinds of questions about bodily functions in space, but I will spare them.
I got all kinds
I will
of
spare our audience the questions right now. So, Linda, last one for you, very tactical. So I've been reading like mask safety protocol advice, and I know that you're not supposed to touch your mask on the outside once you put it on, because in theory, if it's been catching virus, then you put your hands on it, you're kind of back to square one. But so then how is that any different from like your shirt or your pants? In theory, could all of your clothing and potentially your skin, could like virus be falling on it like when I go do my walk or my run? How concerned should I be about that?
So I think I've recently seen an updated article by NPR that it is not as likely to live on outside clothing. In terms of the mask, I mean, that's something that's close to your mouth and nose. So any adjustment to it, you couldn't infect, expose the inside of the mask, I think is more the idea. It's just like, keep your hands away. But the outside clothing and maybe even cardboard and mail, now they're kind of shifting the recommendation that may not be, as much of a risk factor.
Okay, well, that makes me feel a little bit better. So ladies, in the interest of you guys' time, I want to say thank you so much. I am so honored and thankful and appreciative of your time. I feel like I have learned some things, and I certainly feel, it's nice to know that we are all in this together, and we're kind of all going through some of the same challenges. So hearing your perspective has been really refreshing for me. I hope that you guys also enjoyed the conversation. I will follow up with you via email, and I'm going to sign us off. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Bye.